All right. I want to make sure we get enough time for our speaker and our questions, so we're going to get started. Hi, everyone. I am Paul Ferrara from Johns Hopkins University in the United States. Today, I'm co-hosting the seminar with Rachel Martin from Conservation X Labs and Seb Costa-Doat from Conservation International. This is our 10th seminar in the series, still going strong. If you missed our seminars from earlier this year, February, March, and April, you can watch them on the Society for Conservation Biology's Vimeo channel, which we'll be putting in the chat box in a little bit. And we're going to be taking a summer break from June through August. And then we're going to be starting again back in September through the rest of the calendar year. We've got seminars on estimating mechanisms or mediator effects, embedding evaluation designs into project designs, and more on machine learning and satellite data to complement other evaluation designs. This is your first seminar. We start with the speaker, followed by a moderated question and answer session. And for the moderated question and answer session, you can post questions in the chat box, the Zoom chat box, and we encourage you to do that early and often. This is a safe place to ask questions. If you have a question, you're probably not alone. There's probably many other people who have the same question. And Seb and Rachel will be curating those questions so that we can then feed them to Luke during the question and answer period. If you find it helpful, you can activate the live transcription function in Zoom. It's on the menu ribbon under More, choose Live Transcript. This seminar, like all the other seminars, will be recorded and will later be available on SCB's Vimeo channel. If you're registered for the workshop, you'll get an email when that video is posted online with the link to it. If you want to engage with us on social media, please use hashtag Tuesdays with Team Counterfactual and tag @IDoImpact. @IDoImpact is SCB's Impact Evaluation Working Group's Twitter handle. If you're not a member, we encourage you to find out more and get involved. We'll put these links in the chat box. You can follow us on Twitter, sign up for the email list. You won't get a lot of emails, but it will notify you when there are impact evaluation relevant sessions at conferences, for example. And if you want to help us reach full working group status, you can do so by clicking on that link, that Google Doc link that we'll put in the chat box. Just signing your name. It doesn't commit you to anything. It just shows your support for having an impact evaluation working group be officially established. Right now, we are a preliminary group or a pilot group looking for official status. All right. Today, we are lucky to have Luke Sanford, professor from Yale School of the Environment, talking about machine learning for impact evaluation. It's a frontier topic. We're really excited to have him here. And again, I encourage you to put questions in the chat box throughout and take it away, Luke.
Thanks a lot, Paul. As I get my slides ready, I'll say I decided to help all you out by wearing the same outfit as in my headshot there, just to make sure that you all recognize me. Let's see. All right, hopefully you can see my screen.
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Paul, Seb, and Rachel for having me. It's an honor to be here to talk to all of you, academics and practitioners in this space, and especially to follow an amazing set of speakers so far, lots of people whose work I admire and who I've learned a lot from. So yeah, really an honor to be here. I'm Luke Sanford. I'm from Yale School of Environment, as Paul said. And so the motivation for today's talk actually focuses on what I think of as a pretty general problem in the area of conservation impact evaluation, which is we know the location of some probably non-experimental event, program, or policy, and we want to know the effect on some outcome. So that's pretty abstract. Let me give you some examples. These might include do indigenous property rights or protected areas or payments for ecosystem services or other things prevent deforestation. And often these are things that we can't randomize. And so we're in this space where it's non-experimental. Or how many carbon credits should we give someone if they agree not to cut down their forests? Or in today's talk, we'll talk about how land demarcation and tenure formalization can improve agricultural productivity without increasing ecosystem destruction. And so my take on this is how to use remote sensing and machine learning. And this is actually an AI-generated image of me teaching some robots how to classify satellite imagery. So this is what my lab here at Yale looks like. And we've actually been hearing about this quite a bit over the course of this series, but we've mostly focused on using remote sensing and machine learning for measurement. And so this is a picture of a landscape in Bolivia where we have some deforestation. And we'll usually convert this to some measures of the year in which deforestation happened. So here the turquoise is deforestation that happened in 2021. And then as it gets lighter and lighter, it goes back through time. And this is the Hansen data set, the Global Forest Watch data set. And this is a measurement strategy which is really helpful for conducting evaluations at scale. But I'm going to shift gears a little bit and say we can use this to help with the counterfactual question of impact evaluation, which in my mind looks like this. If we want to assess whether a program prevented deforestation, and we have some forested landscape, and this is what it looked like before the program, and this is what it looked like after the program, the question is, did that program prevent deforestation? And it's hard to know. It depends on what would have happened absent the program. And so one possibility is that maybe the landscape would have looked like this absent the program, in which case we can say that program clearly caused some deforestation compared to what would have happened. Or maybe it would have looked like this without the program, in which case it prevented some deforestation. Now also note that all of these images are generated from AI, from this DALL-E model, which is maybe the future of impact evaluation, although it took a lot of effort to get these images to come out. So it's not there yet for using like off-the-shelf new fancy AI models. So to get at that counterfactual question, we have a number of different strategies that we've heard about over the course of these talks. And maybe what we would all agree on is one of the foundational ways to get this right is if we want to evaluate, say, a land tenure project, we could randomly assign which parcels of land get land tenure and which don't. And then we could go to all of those places and we could measure what happens on each of them. And ideally, we're going to do that measurement frequently because it might take a little bit of time for these effects to take effect, or maybe they'll go away quickly. But the reality for many of the programs we want to evaluate is that we only define treated areas. So think of like protected areas. We only know what's the outline of the protected area is. We don't know what the outline of a place that is really similar to the protected area, but not actually a protected area looks like. And often we'll only have limited measurements. So we'll only go there once or maybe twice. And it's because field evaluations are really expensive and can be challenging. And so one solution that we've already heard about is using remote sensing to measure treated areas. And if we have control areas, then we can use remote sensing to measure those too. And I'm sort of saying this like it's an easy thing to do, and it's not necessarily. We've heard some examples of how it can be really challenging or it's easy to get this wrong. But what I want to say is we could also use remote sensing to measure all possibly eligible areas if we don't know what the control areas are. And we could measure those areas both before and after treatment. And then we're going to use the before treatment satellite measures to try to predict what would have happened after the treatment in those control areas. So we're going to use all that satellite information to try to get at what good counterfactuals would have looked like, or what we should compare what we observed to. And so the question is, can we recover what we get with a strategy like this, using a strategy like this, and my team of robots? So let me put this in a little bit more context by taking you to Benin. Benin is this country in West Africa. And in Benin, there was this Plan Foncier Rural program, which took place from 2009 to 2011. And the fundamental question of this program was, do improved property rights or formal property rights lead to land improvement and land sparing? So that means, can people make their land more productive? And do they destroy fewer ecosystems? And the way that the impact worked, the program worked, was they randomized access to this Plan Foncier Rural program at the village level. So on the right, I actually have a map of one of these, which you could find in the village centers of the places which got the program. And it has outlines of all of the parcels of land which received formal land titles. In the villages which were randomly selected to be part of this program, all of the applicants for their land demarcation were granted, and eventually they were all granted titles to the land that they own. And so today I'm actually just going to focus on two departments of Benin, which are Alibori and Borgu. And in those departments, there were about 130 villages which were in this program, about half of which had the PFR program and had land titling, and half of which didn't. And the reason we're focusing on these two places is that they're both in the northern part of Benin, which is the most land insecure area. So about 70% of civil court cases about land and most of the incidences of land conflict occur in the northern part of Benin. So why land tenure security? And the theory is actually that improving land tenure security is a huge possibility for a win-win scenario in conservation. And this is because weak property rights reduce investment. If you're not sure that you're going to be able to hold on to the land that you currently own for a long time, then you might not want to invest in things that make that land more valuable, because that makes your land a target for expropriation. And so instead, you're going to plant annual crops, or crops that you can harvest right away, which are lower value, and fewer perennial crops, which can be things like tree crops, which are often higher value. And you might be incentivized to actually clear more land to claim ownership of that land. So if you own some land which has forests on it, it's hard for you to claim ownership of that if you don't have a map that says, this is my land. And so you might clear it just to prove that it's yours. And this leads to deforestation, ecosystem destruction. These are just a couple of the mechanisms, but you can imagine that improving people's land tenure security might lead them to be better off by allowing them to plant higher value crops or invest more in their land, and also leave ecosystems better off as people reduce agricultural expansion. But there's pretty mixed evidence from a whole host of interventions. I think the last time I checked, there had been about $3 billion spent on land tenure interventions and evaluations. And they really have different outcomes depending on the setting or the type of intervention. But the Benin Plan Foncier Rural program is the largest and one of the only randomized control trials for land tenure impact evaluations. So to do this evaluation, this is the data that we're going to use. The unit of observation is going to be one 30 meter by 30 meter pixel, which is what you get if you use the Landsat 7 or 8 satellites. And there are about 1.3 million of these pixels in Benin. And we're going to sample 1 out of every 100 pixels so that our computers don't break, but also so that we don't have spatial spillovers, so we don't learn too much from neighboring pixels. And the treatment is going to be whether the pixel is in a 5-kilometer buffer around a village center. So we don't actually know what the outlines of many of these villages are. So we're just going to say, if you're within 5 kilometers of a village center, we'll call you in a treated village. And the outcome is going to be whether is going to be the land cover type in 2020, as measured by the European Space Agency globe cover data set. And this is itself a machine learned data set using satellite imagery. And the covariates that we'll use are the Landsat satellite record from 2006 to 2008. So we're going to use all the satellite images we have of that area over those 3 years. We're going to use the rainfall in that spot over the same 3 years. We're going to use accessibility, which is about how long it would take to travel to the nearest city, the elevation and the slope of each one of those places. And so I can tell you about it, but maybe it's easier to show you a picture. Here's Benin. The red circles are all the treated villages, or all the villages which were selected. And the blue circles are all the places which were randomly not selected to get this, or the control villages. And if we zoom in, we have all the points that I'm measuring here. Some of them fall in the red villages, some fall in the blue, some fall outside. And we have in gray here all the parcels which were outlined. And we're not going to use those today, but I use those in the paper. And so this is what a village looks like in high resolution satellite imagery. this is what it looks like in the European Space Agency data set, where like red is built up, purple is cropland, orange is like natural vegetation. And this is what it looks like in the Landsat imagery. So it's a little bit harder to make out what the landscape looks like in Landsat. And here's how I'm going to do the evaluation. So the evaluation strategy is guided by this double machine learning framework, which, I like to think of as machine learning so nice, let's do it twice, from this paper in 2018. I'm going to use satellite images and machine learning to predict whether any area is likely to be in a treated village. And I'll also use satellite images to predict what I think the 2020 land cover is going to be. And these satellite images are the images from before the program was implemented. So it's using information from 2008 and before. Can we predict which areas are going to be in the program in 2010? And can we predict what the landscape is going to look like in 2020? And we're going to use those predictions to make sure that the probability of being included in treatment is balanced across the treated and control groups. And we'll also only use the part of the outcome or the part of the land cover in 2020, which can't be predicted from pre-treatment images. And these are all going to go into an augmented inverse propensity score weighting estimator, which is a mouthful, but here's the intuition, which is the more of a treatment that we can predict before the treatment's assigned, the less useful it is for inference. And so it's like, if we think that randomization is the gold standard, if we can predict whether an area is going to be selected as a treated village or a control village, then it's not random because it's predictable. And so that means maybe we shouldn't use the information that we can predict. Similarly, any part of the outcome or the 2020 land cover, which we can predict before the treatment is assigned, is also not useful for inference because it can't have been caused by the treatment. So if we can predict what the land cover will look like in 2020, starting in 2008, then it means that the land cover that we observe in 2020, which was predictable, can't have been because of the 2010 treatment. And then we're going to throw away all those parts of the treatment and all those parts of the outcome, which are predictable because they're not useful for inference. And once we throw those away, we'll get something which is closer to a randomized control trial. The nice thing about this type of estimator, it's called a doubly robust estimator, and it has this property where if we can accurately predict the treatment or the outcome, or if we do okay at predicting both, we'll get a result which is unbiased. And I'll show you that this works out in this case. So here's maybe an easier graphical representation. We use these pre-treatment satellite images to predict both 2020 land cover and whether an area is going to be in a parcel. Maybe a different way to look at this is if we want to know the impact of a land title on whether someone's going to plant tree crops, we might run into the issue where a whole bunch of factors might both determine whether somebody applies for a land title and whether they plant tree crops, like soil quality, the microclimate, farmer skill, previous land use in that area. And if we don't account for these, we might misattribute the effect of planting tree crops to having a land title when really it was caused by the microclimate. So we want to be able to adjust for these things or to block these backdoor pathways. And one way that we can probably do this is by using satellite data. And we know from tons and tons of papers that satellite imagery can predict things like soil quality, microclimate, farmer skill, previous land use. And so another way to think about what I'm doing in this paper is just directly controlling for the history of satellite images instead of controlling for each one of those individual known confounders. And just a quick note on machine learning is that machine learning algorithms, they love to cheat and they love to memorize answers. So you can think of them as like the overeager student in your class who goes and memorizes the answers to all the practice exams that you put online. And this causes them both to be not very good at answering questions that they haven't seen, and also really overconfident about their expected performance on the exam. And both of those are going to cause issues if we try to use machine learning in the causal inference. And so as usual, XKCD says it better than I can, which is machine learning systems are often just big piles of linear algebra, and you stir it for a while until the answers look good. And so this double machine learning process has lots of statistical machinery to make sure that these aspects of machine learning don't bias the results. And the most fundamental part of this is that all of the predictions that I'll show you are out of sample predictions. So they're on the actual test, not on the practice tests that our student memorized. And so what does all this get us? Well, it allows us to adjust for differences which affect pre-treatment behavior of farmers. So that could be things like farmers' skill or soil type or existing vegetation. Things which might be hard to adjust for if you were just doing an on-the-ground evaluation. But it's also not magic. It's only as good as your satellite data and your machine learning model. And so this is actually an area that I'm working on a lot right now with this paper, is to try to improve the machine learning models that we're using to try to make it better at adjusting for things which are harder to see or harder to measure. It also can't capture anything which isn't visible from space. And so there are likely still potential confounders out there that this doesn't get you out of. So I want to take a minute now and talk about like how satellites see the Earth, or what kind of information we can get from satellite data. So here I have a high resolution, not publicly available. This is like a Google base map image of a village in Benin. We have a built up area, some natural vegetation, some annual cropland, and some perennial crops, or some tree crops. These are cashew trees. And if we look at it in Landsat imagery, this is what we get. And so it's a little bit harder to tell what these land cover types are just from a static Landsat image, or you might have a hard time labeling the other parts of this image, which are each of these land cover types. But this Landsat image is composed of several bands or wavelengths of light, red, green, and blue, but not just those three. In fact, Landsat will measure 8 different bands, or 8 different wavelengths or parts of the spectrum. And we're going to make use of several of those. So these are the 3 visible bands. We also have band 4 here, which is near infrared, which looks like this. And if we want to make use of some of the other bands, we could do band combinations like normalized difference vegetation index, which is one of the most commonly used measures in remote sensing. Or we could do some false color composition. So here I have band 7 as red, 5 as green, and 4 as blue. And here we can really clearly see our planted trees compared to the other land cover types. And we won't just use the bands, but we'll also use variation over time. So this is a few years of Landsat data for each of those areas. We have built up in red, cropland in green, natural vegetation in blue, and the cashew trees in purple. You can see over time, especially in some of these, like band 7, it's really easy to tell what the differences are by that temporal variation. So each one of these boxes is one of the bands or band combination of Landsat. And then a common way to sort of take out a bunch of the noise in this data is called harmonic smoothing. So we're going to fit a couple of sine wave looking things to our sort of messy jumbled data to smooth things out. And when you do this, you can really see a difference in the intensity of NDVI over time for each one of these land cover classes. And then we'll put that smooth thing into a machine learning model, which is a random forest in this case. So we'll start out with our measurements. Here I have NDVI for each one of the land cover classes. And we'll also put in enhanced vegetation index, normalized difference built up index, and precipitation. We'll smooth each one of those to get rid of all these jagged bits or get rid of a bunch of the noise. And then we'll take that smoothed time series and put it into a random forest. And the random forest is going to try to predict what the eventual land cover is going to be. So that's what my robots are doing. So, you know, I've told you a lot about ways that I think I can get this to work. And the question is, does it work? And so here's the comparison that I'll show you. In sort of a normal conservation impact evaluation setting, maybe this is what you would have. You know what your treated areas are, and you know that you want to learn about what would have happened in those treated areas from the part that's outside of those areas. And so we're going to use the whole of the Alibori and Borgu departments. And we're going to call the areas inside these red villages treated, and we'll call everywhere else control. And then we'll try to use machine learning to estimate out of sample which areas were in the treated parts and which areas were in the control. And so here on the x-axis, I have the estimated probability of being in a treated area. And on the y-axis, I have the density. And here, our machine learning algorithm is pretty good at distinguishing treated areas from control areas. So these two curves look pretty different. And if you ask it to randomly, if you ask it to guess, it'll get it right about 80% of the time, whether an area is in a treated or control area. The alternative, which we can do in this setting, because it was a randomized control trial, is we can sample only from the known villages, which were eligible for the PFR. And so here the red are treated, blue are control. And when we just cut it down to those areas, our previous version of this graph was everything outside treated village versus the stuff inside treated villages. And here we've just limited it to places which are inside treated villages, inside control villages. And the good news is that it does a pretty good job of saying that treated areas are very similar to control areas. Or out of sample, it says the control areas were about as eligible to receive treatment as the treated areas were. And we can guess that using the pre-treatment satellite imagery. And so here's what the predicted treatment map actually looks like. So here we have the probability that each pixel will be treated, with the highest being about 0.5. And this is, again, just using the pre-treatment satellite imagery. And it gets us pretty good balance. And if you want to think of this in the framework of like matching, these are the parts of Alibori and Borgu which had similar probabilities of being treated, or that we guess look similar enough to the treated areas in red that we might want to include them in our like synthetic or imagined control areas. And so, if you spend as much time as I have looking at satellite images of Benin or studying the area, this is actually a pretty good map of what the places are that kind of look like the treated villages. Similarly, we're also, remember, trying to predict what the land cover is going to be in 2020 using pre-treatment satellite images. And so here we have the probability of the land cover being built up, and we are picking out the big cities here, being cropland. And here you can see part of the W Park, which is in the northern part of Benin, shrubland or natural vegetation, and then trees, which are these orchards. And you can see sort of a north-south gradient in orchards, but also orchards tend to cluster around very particular areas of the country. And so all of these are pretty good, given that we're trying to predict 12 years into the future. So what does it get us when you put all this stuff together? So here's sort of what I'm looking for, is if a land title gives you increased land tenure security, then land tenure reform should produce a few different outcomes. One is an increase in tree crops, because you're not afraid to plant those. The second is increase in natural vegetation, because you don't have to cut down as much natural vegetation to exert ownership over the land. Third is decrease in total cropland. And that's because you get increased productivity from your tree crops, and you have less of an incentive to cut down the natural vegetation. And fourth is maybe we'll see an increase in built-up area if the eventual result of this land tenure reform is that we see more economic development. And so the question that I'm asking is, can we recover the answer we get with this, which is the randomized control trial, just using this, which is just where the treatment areas are? So here are what the results look like, and I'll take a second to really walk you through this. So this is the results from the randomized control trial, plus a couple of covariates. And what we see here on the x-axis is the effect of being in a treated village. And on the y-axis, we have these different land cover types. And here in the RCT, we see no effects on any of the land cover types in the year 2020. Now, if we stick to that randomized control trial setting where we're only comparing the red villages to the blue villages, and we still plug it into the satellite double machine learning, so that's SDML, the satellite double machine learning estimator, we can shrink our error bars because we're predicting away some of the variation in 2020 outcomes. But we still get basically the same results. And this should, I mean, it makes sense that we can't really improve on a randomized control trial. Now I've taken those two estimates and put them in dashed lines and put two new estimates in solid lines. And the solid lines estimates are what we get if we compare the villages, the treated villages or those red villages, versus everything else in either of the two departments. If we use conventional strategies like ordinary least squares with covariates, or even if we use matching, we'll get something which is really different from what we got in the randomized control trial. And so we'll call these biased results. So if we do that, we'll see that we'll estimate that there's a decrease in tree cover in the treated villages, a decrease in shrubland, an increase in cropland. And the reason for this is that the villages are really different from the places that are outside the villages and far away from them. And the places which are far away from villages or weren't eligible tend to have more shrubland and less cropland. And so we're attributing the effect of the treatment to something which wasn't caused by the treatment. On the other hand, if we look at these blue solid bars, these are what we get if we compare the red circles to everything else. But we try to use satellite imagery to adjust for the inherent differences between those two places. And you'll see that we'll recover almost exactly the estimates that we got from the randomized control trial or the more precise version of the randomized control trial. And so what this shows, at least in this setting, is that we can recover these randomized control trial estimates without knowing what the control areas were. And we can additionally improve on the precision of the randomized control trial estimates. We can shrink the error bars with this machine learning strategy. And so I hope that this is a way to make evaluations of non-random spatial treatments, like we see in conservation impact evaluation, a little bit more robust to things which are hard to measure using conventional approaches. But if you want to know about the specific results in Aliboria and Borgu, the only thing that's significant is we see an increase in built-up area outside of the treated parcels. And so this is, if you do the parcel level analysis, in addition to the village level analysis, we see that in villages, but outside the parcels, there are more built-up areas, which is consistent with an overall increase in economic development. But at least in 2020, we don't see significant results of the RCT. There are a lot of reasons why, or a lot of potential explanations for why this is the case. And I have other research that tries to explain that. But the main reason might be political changes in Benin, or things that made the impact last for a little while and then go away over time. There are lots of other applications that my team and I have in the works. And I guess stay tuned if you want to hear about some of those. In the meantime, really excited to answer some of your questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Luke. That was super interesting, and I think that's the first time we talk about double machine learning and non-tenure actually in this seminar series. So that was fantastic and very clear presentations. So there's been some questions, and people, if you still have a question, feel free to write them directly in the chat, and I will do my best to do the triage and present them to Luke. But for starter, just a clarification on the figure you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation, do you have any idea where the figure of $3 billion spent on tenure intervention is coming from? That's a figure we're repeating a lot. What someone's asking about. What's your source?
Yeah, so it's from a review paper that was published in 2020 that tried to capture all of the land tenure reform interventions, and I can't remember the site off the top of my head, but I think they went through about 1,000 papers that they thought might have been about land tenure reforms, came up with about 150 of them that actually they considered to be impact evaluations of land tenure interventions. And then they categorized those into different types of impact evaluations. And they actually found that there had only been 4, which were randomized control trials, and a variety of interesting approaches to trying to evaluate the impacts of those things. So maybe that's part of the reason why we have sort of inconsistent results.
Okay. Thanks. Thanks, Luke. There is some question probably on the identification strategies, and I'm starting with that one. So, someone is wondering whether you consider the endogeneity of planting tree crops for tenures. For example, are people planting tree crops to actually increase the tenure security in Benin, and how do you take that into account?
Yeah, this is a huge and a really important question, I think, for the field of evaluating land tenure security. And the challenge is that there are 2 pathways to planting more tree crops. One is if you have improved land tenure security, and you're doing that to try to improve your economic output. And so you can plant tree crops which give you higher value crops. Alternatively, what some people have found is that people with low land tenure security plant tree crops as a way to claim ownership of the land or make their ownership of the land more clear. And so they'll plant tree crops to help demarcate the land for which they don't have a formal tenure. They don't have formal tenure. Now, my impression in Benin is that people might do some tree planting to try to improve their land ownership, but that this doesn't show up as tree crops. And it's because, at least in the landscape of northern Benin, those trees are really sparse. So they tend to be a single tree surrounded by a field. And there, it's not something that we're measuring for tree cover. Whereas the tree crops, so like the cashew plantation that I showed you in one of those satellite images, is not something someone would do to try to improve their land tenure security. It's something that they'll do to try to make extra income off of the land. So I think it's a really important question, and one where some context knowledge matters a lot.
Okay, and yeah, talking still on probably the identification strategy, there is probably a question. I think it's an ironic question. Oh, sorry, I'm lost in my notes. Oh yeah. So probably question on the unobservables. What features of the satellite images did you use to control for farmer skills? So I'm just reading the questions, but I think.
Yeah. So I haven't directly tried to measure farmer skill. So the assumption here is that farmers who are higher skilled or who have different skill sets will act in a way that's different, which leads to changes on their land. So you could imagine that farmers who are skilled at producing one crop type versus another one will plant more of that crop type. And if that crop grows differently over the year than what someone else is growing, then that will show up in this overtime variation in our vegetation index. And so you could imagine that differences, like direct differences in farmer skill, might show up in the height of the peak of the NDVI in the growing season, where people who are higher skilled or have more labor to put in or more inputs are able to have their crops grow faster or larger. And that's something which we can measure with this strategy. Sort of a challenge or part of dealing with machine learning here is that it's hard to tell if it is measuring exactly any one of those things. I take a little bit of comfort in knowing that people have used this machine learning strategy to measure farmer skill and done so somewhat successfully, or to measure agricultural outputs. But I can't say in this particular case how good of a job it's doing in that particular setting.
Okay, and another contextual questions. Someone is wondering if it was possible for the machine learning to address concerns about migration, especially when there isn't a RCT to ground truth your results.
Yeah, so this is another pretty important question in this context, or in the context of land tenure reform broadly, which is one of the impacts that people have noted, is that land tenure reform, because it makes it easier for people to claim ownership of their land without like going and cutting down trees on the land that they own, or like tilling their land or making fences, that the people who were previously employed in that type of unproductive labor, and unproductive in the sense that it's not improving their livelihoods or the livelihoods of the people who own that land, those people might be able to migrate to cities instead, where they have higher paying jobs. And so if that's what people's response is, then we'll see less ecosystem conversion, because those people won't be employed in less productive labor that's just sort of like land claiming, and instead move to cities. So we can't directly measure migration. We can measure the effect that migration has on the landscape. And so this is just like maybe sort of a more broad way to think about this, is that when we're using remote sensing as a measurement method, or as a way to help us with inference, we have to think on the landscape level rather than on the people level. And that is going to be satisfying for some questions, and it's going to be deeply unsatisfying for other questions. And that's sort of what we get with this type of strategy.
Okay, thank you, Luke. So now transitioning specifically to machine learning algorithm. Someone is asking if you iteratively tune the machine learning algorithm to achieve predictions that match the RCT? And if yes, how would we know in a normal case, when there is no RCT benchmark, that we are close to the truth?
That's right. So we don't do any iterative tuning. What I'm trying to do is fair of a comparison as I can between what you would get if you just did the RCT analysis versus what you would get if you had no idea what the control areas were, or if it were a like pure observational study. And so I don't let any of the like RCT information leak into the non-RCT evaluation. What maybe the second question, which is, how do you know if it worked if you don't have an RCT alongside? And the answer is, in all of these observational strategies, you can't know if it worked perfectly. And this will be true for matching, it'll be true for synthetic controls, it'll be true for regression discontinuity designs. You have to rely on some assumptions. The thing that I think that this gets us is, like, if you know that you're in this selection on observables world where you don't have an RCT and you have to do the best you can with the information that you have, it's going to be a good idea to include all the information that you can get from satellite images, in addition to all the information that you gathered on the ground or from administrative data. So the more information that you can include to try to reduce bias or confounding, the better.
Okay, so that's a little bit to transition a little bit to, are you using any goodness of fit statistics in your model?
Yeah, a whole bunch of them for different parts of it, different aspects, and that's sort of where a lot of the work is right now that I'm doing is really in the weeds with trying to tune different machine learning models and seeing how well they do on different aspects of this prediction problem. And then seeing from there if it actually helps us get closer to the RCT result or not, especially in a more challenging setting as we expand to the full country, which is really heterogeneous in terms of land types, in terms of the type of agriculture that people are doing. So the answer is yes. And if you're interested in that, we can have a different, longer conversation.
Okay. Now there were actually another question about whether you have compared your performance of this double machine learning approach to other impact evaluation that we expect to be rigorous. And so yeah, you are exploring that area as well.
Yeah, I can say a little bit about that. So I've done comparisons with like the strategy where you take a buffer around whatever the treated village is. So you say like, this is a treated village, and then we'll take 3 kilometers outside of that and call that the control. So this would be like a spatial regression discontinuity design. And for that one, you get some bias and you get really big standard errors because you're throwing away information from everywhere that's not within 3 kilometers of whatever a treated village is. And the more you expand that buffer, the smaller your standard errors get, but the larger the bias gets because you're including places which were not eligible to receive the PFR program. Similarly, if you do matching on things like distance to a road, slope, elevation, even if you match on things like average pre-treatment NDVI, you end up with bias, and it's again this like bias variance trade-off where the more things you decide to match on, the smaller your comparison sample is, the larger your standard errors get. But the weaker you make the matching, the more precise the estimate you get, but the more bias you end up including.
Okay. And again, question on the RCT benchmark. Was there a specific advantage of using an RCT with no measurable impact for testing the machine learning approach in comparison to an RCT where we have demonstrating an impact? Does it? Yeah. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah. So whoever you are who asked that question, if you have a good spatial RCT that has an impact, which is visible in satellite imagery, for which this would be a good setting, let's get in touch. This is one of the few RCTs where I can get the outlines of the treated areas and the control areas and measure the impact with satellite imagery, or measure the spatial impact or the impact at the pixel scale. And so it's maybe a good benchmark, because one of the most important things I think with this type of study is that it's pretty important to be able to reject false positives. And this shows that it's able to do that. Now, the danger is that you might say that this strategy is a strategy which is only going to get you a null result, no matter where you apply it. And I think that that's not maybe not likely to be the case, given that we have recovered some positive results here, and that we're shrinking the confidence intervals using this strategy compared to what you would get with just the RCT evaluation. But yeah, if you have that intervention, I would love to talk and try to take this machinery and plop it down in your setting and see what we get.
Okay, great. So now let's talk about the covariates. Can you share a bit on which covariates the machine learning model found to be the most predictive of the probability of treatment, especially if it's more environmental or socioeconomic variables, and how generalizable that be to other setups with similar land tenure interventions?
Yeah, so I haven't included any socioeconomic variables here. I've only included satellite imagery. And that's partially because it's hard to get a pixel measure of socioeconomic variables in Benin, or the census data there that's available is not available at a very fine scale. So we can't use it at the same scale as the rest of the data that we've compiled. When I look at which features are most predictive, that tends to be the annual and semi-annual phase and mode of NDVI, which is this vegetation index that people use. It actually turns out that including rainfall alongside NDVI is really helpful as a predictor, because we know that vegetation responds to rainfall, but agricultural vegetation or crops respond to rainfall differently than natural vegetation. So we actually see some decoupling in agriculture and rainfall, or vegetation and rainfall in agriculture compared to vegetation and rainfall in the natural vegetation. So those are sort of the two biggest predictors. And surprisingly, things like slope and elevation did almost none of the work in prediction. I also learned that if you include NDVI and EVI, that you have to include both of them generally, that one of them is going to be sufficient.
Okay, so jumping back on the machine learning algorithm you are using, do you think there's potential to apply either the double machine learning or more generally machine learning approaches when the treatment is actually a continuous variable? Do you have any thoughts on the potential to apply in this context?
Yeah, you can. There's some good sort of more theoretical papers out there about this setting. But sort of one of the nice things about double machine learning is you can also predict treatment intensity. So if treatment is continuous, you can predict what you think the value of that treatment is going to be. And it's actually a little bit easier where there are fewer assumptions than doing it in levels. Because if you're predicting just 0 or 1, you'll always underpredict the places that have a treatment of 1, and you'll always overpredict the places that have a treatment of 0. So you end up with this, like, this stuff is squished towards the center, whereas continuous treatments are a little bit easier there.
Do one more question, Seb, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. And actually, the last question we have for you, and if you can briefly mention, new promising areas for application, either from your own research or from things you have seen where your specific approach or the field you are kind of exploring could show promising results.
Yeah, so I hid these in the very beginning. So I think that some of the most promising areas are estimating the effects of protected areas, and especially different types of protected areas. It's often hard to figure out what we should compare protected areas when we evaluate how well they're working at improving biodiversity or preventing deforestation. Similarly, payments for ecosystem services are often not randomized, right? They're often rolled out by governments or NGOs that want to spend their money actually giving people payments rather than outlining places and then saying, actually, you're not eligible to receive payments. Or even I think maybe this is the most promising, is that because we have this satellite record on file that goes back tens of years, right? It goes back decades. There are lots of interventions for which they weren't randomized. And when people evaluated them at the time, they used methods which included some on-the-ground demographic survey administrative data. But we can go back and use satellite data to reevaluate those and say, what if we looked at the Landsat record prior to your intervention, and we built controls based on that? Will we find the same thing? Or can we, for example, maybe go back and reevaluate a lot of these land tenure interventions and see if this strategy gets us more consistent answers or something which is more useful for policymakers.
Fantastic.
Thanks so much, Luke.
Luke, thanks so much for taking a complicated topic and making it digestible. It was a perfect pitch for the group. I learned a lot and I hope everybody else did as well. Thanks for everybody for coming, for staying till the end. We'll be back on September 5th. And we'll be emailing out everybody who's registered what the schedule will be for those months. Sometime in the next month or two, we'll email that out. So have a good day, everybody. Good week, and we'll see you in September.